The Mediterranean was calm at 4:15 inches the morning, the kind of calm that does not announce what it is about to witness. At Haifa Port, Israel's largest naval installation and the logistical core of its northern military command, everything moved with the quiet predictability of routine. Patrol boats traced slow arcs along the outer perimeter. Radar operators watched their screens with the practiced stillness of people who expect nothing to happen. A destroyer rested at berth, taking on fuel. Corvettes sat anchored in the inner basin. The submarine facilities along the northern edge hummed with low, steady electrical life. It was not just a port, it was a system functioning exactly as designed, and like all systems that function smoothly, it gave no indication of how fragile that smoothness really was. At 4:17, the horizon changed. Not visibly, not in a way the human eye could register, but in the abstract world of radar signatures and moving data points. A single low-altitude contact appeared, moving fast from the northwest. The operator flagged it, a small anomaly in an otherwise empty field. Then more appeared. 40, then 100, then so many that the screen itself began to lose coherence, dissolving into something closer to static than structured information. 400 separate returns, all moving at speeds and vectors that the system was never designed to process simultaneously. The algorithm did what algorithms do when pushed beyond their limits. It froze. The human operator reached for the alert. He was 2 seconds too late. At 4:18, the first wave struck. Not one missile, not a handful, but a coordinated sequence designed with precision that only reveals itself after the fact. The outer breakwater absorbed the initial impacts, a sacrificial shield that had been built to protect what lay behind it. The second wave followed almost immediately, targeting the fuel depot. Fire does not need time to become catastrophic when it begins with millions of liters of stored energy. The third wave arrived seconds later, heavier, more destructive, aimed not at infrastructure, but at capability. Ships at berth, arranged in the geometry of peacetime, became fixed targets in a war that had already decided their fate. By the time 13 minutes had passed, the port was no longer a port. It was fire, smoke, and the collapsing remnants of something that had taken decades to build. The Israeli Navy, a force that had projected power across the Eastern Mediterranean for generations, ceased to exist as a operational entity in the space of those 13 minutes. Not degraded, not damaged, but effectively erased. And less than 300 nautical miles away, the United States Sixth Fleet watched everything unfold in real time. Every radar track, every missile trajectory, every impact coordinate. The data was complete, the awareness total. Targeting solutions existed. Aircraft were already in the air. The machinery of response was present, functioning, and waiting. The order never came. When the sun rose over Haifa, it illuminated not just destruction, but a question that would echo far beyond the burning harbor. What is an alliance worth when its guarantor chooses observation over intervention? This is where the story begins, not ends, because what happened in those 13 minutes is not simply a military event, it is a revelation, a stress test of systems, assumptions, and relationships that have defined the international order for decades. And like all meaningful stress tests, it did not just measure strength, it exposed limits. To understand the scale of what occurred, you have to move beyond the immediate visuals of explosions and fire and into the logic that made them possible. Haifa was not an unprotected target. It was, on paper, one of the most heavily defended naval installations in the world. Layered defenses, overlapping systems, redundancies designed to ensure that no single failure could cascade into catastrophe. Missile defense platforms calibrated for multiple threat vectors. Close-in defense systems designed to intercept what slipped through the outer layers. a structure built on the assumption that threats would come, but that they would come in forms that could be managed. That assumption did not survive contact with volume. 400 missiles is not a test of precision, it is a test of capacity. It asks a different question entirely, not whether you can intercept, but how many you can intercept before the system itself becomes the bottleneck. Every defensive architecture has a saturation point, a moment where the number of incoming threats exceeds the system's ability to respond in time. That moment is not theoretical. It is measurable, calculable, and if you are an adversary willing to invest the effort, exploitable. The strike on Haifa was built entirely around that insight. Missiles did not arrive from a single direction. They came in waves, from multiple vectors, timed to converge in a way that forced the defensive systems to divide their attention. From the open sea, from angles less optimized for interception, from landward approaches masked by terrain until the last possible moment, each wave was not just an attack, but a layer in a larger design, one that compressed decision-making timelines and overwhelmed processing capacity. The result was not a failure of technology. It was a demonstration of its limits. And that distinction matters because it changes the lesson. This was not about one side having better weapons than the other. It was about one side understanding the system well enough to break it, not by outmatching it, but by exceeding it. This is where the story expands beyond Haifa, beyond Israel, beyond even the immediate actors involved, because the missiles that struck that port did not emerge in isolation. They are part of a broader shift in how military power is developed, distributed, and applied. The Atmaka missile, developed by Turkey, represents a particular kind of capability, indigenous, advanced, and built within the framework of NATO standards. It is, in many ways, a product of the very system it was later used to challenge, designed for interoperability, for integration into alliance structures, for use alongside the forces of partners and allies. And yet, in this instance, it became something else entirely. How that transformation occurred is not a simple story of transfer or transaction. It is a reflection of a deeper change in the nature of alliances themselves. The assumption that membership implies alignment, that shared systems imply shared objectives, is no longer reliable in the way it once was. States are no longer operating within fixed categories of ally and adversary. They are operating within a more fluid environment where relationships are transactional, multidimensional, and often contradictory. Turkey remains a member of NATO. That fact has not changed. What has changed is how that membership functions in practice. Strategic autonomy, once a concept discussed in theoretical terms, has become operational reality. Decisions are made not solely within the framework of alliance expectations, but within a broader calculation of national interest that may align with, diverge from, or directly contradict those expectations. The transfer of advanced anti-ship missiles to Iran, whether acknowledged or denied, fits within that evolving logic. It is not an anomaly, it is a signal, and signals in international politics are rarely sent without purpose. From Iran's perspective, the acquisition of such capability represents a form of strategic acceleration. The ability to bypass the long, resource-intensive process of development and instead integrate proven systems into existing doctrine, it is efficiency, but more importantly, it is leverage. The ability to act decisively without bearing the full cost of creation. From Turkey's perspective, the calculation is more complex. It is not simply about the transfer itself, but about what that transfer enables in terms of positioning between East and West, between competing power centers, between established orders and emerging ones. It is a bet not just on immediate outcomes, but on the direction of the system as a whole. And that brings us back to the United States, to the fleet that watched, to the decision that was made in those critical minutes. Non-engagement is not the absence of action. It is a form of action in itself. It communicates boundaries, priorities, constraints. It tells observers not just what will be done, but what will not be done, even under conditions of extreme consequence. The reasons behind that decision are not difficult to understand. Escalation risks, domestic political considerations, legal frameworks, the potential for broader conflict involving other major powers. These are real factors, and they shape decision-making in ways that are often invisible to those observing from the outside. But understanding the reasons does not negate the impact. Deterrence is not built solely on capability. It is built on perception, on the belief that certain actions will trigger certain responses. When that belief is tested and found to have limits, even if those limits are rational, the structure it supports begins to shift. What happened off the coast of Haifa was not just a military event, it was a test of that perception. And the outcome of that test will not be confined to the Mediterranean. Russia is watching, China is watching, regional powers, smaller states, non-aligned actors, all observing not just the strike itself, but the responses that followed and those that did not. Each will interpret the event through their own frameworks, their own objectives, their own expectations of how power operates. And those interpretations will shape future actions. This is how systems evolve, not through singular events, but through the accumulation of moments that redefine what is considered possible, what is considered likely, and what is considered acceptable. Haifa is one of those moments. It reveals a world where technological sophistication can be countered by scale, where alliances are not as rigid as their structures suggest, where strategic decisions are constrained by factors that extend far beyond the battlefield, where the boundaries of action are tested not in theory but in real time, with consequences that cannot be undone. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals a world where the pace of change is outstripping the ability of existing institutions to fully process it. The Mediterranean this morning looked the same as it did yesterday. The water did not change, the geography did not shift, but the meaning of that space, the assumptions that governed it, the expectations that defined behavior within it have all been altered. Not completely, not irreversibly, but enough to matter. And in international politics, enough to matter is often where the most significant transformations begin. What remains after a shock like Haifa is never just debris, it is interpretation. Because in international politics, events do not end when the explosions stop. They begin to live again in briefing rooms, intelligence assessments, parliamentary debates, and military planning cycles. The physical destruction is immediate, but the strategic meaning is constructed slowly and often with far greater consequence than the event itself. In Washington, the first hours after Haifa were not defined by confusion about what happened, but by recognition of what it meant. The data was not ambiguous. The Sixth Fleet had seen everything in real time. The trajectory plots, the launch signatures, the impact confirmations. There was no informational gap. There was instead a decision gap, a gap between awareness and action. And that gap is where strategy becomes visible. Because modern power is not only measured by what a state can do, it is measured by what it chooses to do when it can do almost anything. The United States had the capability to intervene in multiple ways during the attack. That is not in question. The systems were active, the aircraft were airborne, the targeting solutions were locked. What mattered was not capability, but authorization. And authorization in a system as complex as the American national security apparatus is never automatic. It is negotiated in real time between military logic, political risk, legal constraint, and strategic escalation thresholds that exist as much in perception as in law. What emerged in those minutes was not indecision in the simplistic sense. It was constraint, a recognition that every available option carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Direct engagement with Iranian forces risked expansion into a regional war. Inaction risked the erosion of deterrence credibility. There was no outcome without cost. And in such conditions, states do not choose between good and bad options. They choose between different forms of loss. The decision not to intervene kinetically against Iranian assets was therefore not an absence of will. It was a calculation of containment, a belief that escalation control, even at the cost of immediate tactical loss, preserved a broader strategic equilibrium that could still be managed. But every calculation of containment carries a hidden variable, the assumption that other actors will interpret restraint in the same way it is intended. Iran did not interpret restraint as stability. It interpreted it as bounded permissiveness. This distinction is critical because in the Iranian strategic framework, the objective has never been to provoke maximal war with the United States. It has been to map the edges of American response and operate just inside them. Not to break the system outright, but to demonstrate that the system can be pressured, stretched, and selectively bypassed. The Haifa strike, in that sense, was not just an attack on Israel. It was a test of the American response envelope. And from Iran's perspective, the results were unambiguous. The threshold for direct American military intervention was higher than the destruction of a major allied naval installation, even when that destruction occurred in real time under full American observation. That knowledge changes behavior because deterrence is not static, it is adaptive. Once a boundary is identified, it becomes a reference point for future action planning, not necessarily for repetition, but for calibration. The question shifts from what is possible to what is possible without triggering escalation. And that is where the strategic landscape begins to fundamentally transform. Israel, meanwhile, is facing a different kind of reckoning. The loss of its naval operational capability is not simply a material deficit. It is a structural one. Navies are not interchangeable assets. They are systems of projection, logistics, deterrence, and regional influence. They require time, training, infrastructure, and continuity. When that continuity is broken, it cannot be instantly restored by procurement. What has been lost is not just ships, it is coherence. For decades, Israeli maritime doctrine relied on a combination of technological superiority and predictable escalation dominance in its immediate theater. That doctrine assumed that any attempt to challenge Israeli naval presence would be met with overwhelming interception capability and rapid retaliation options. That assumption no longer holds in the same way, not because Israel's technology has degraded in isolation, but because the scale of threat it now faces has evolved beyond the design assumptions of that system. Rebuilding is possible, but rebuilding is not the same as restoring. The gap between the two is measured in years, in budgets, in training cycles, and in strategic vulnerability during transition periods. And during those periods, deterrence is not absent, it is incomplete. Turkey's position in this new configuration is perhaps the most structurally complex. It is a NATO member that has participated directly or indirectly in an event that resulted in the destruction of a key partner's military capability. Whether framed as facilitation, transfer, or strategic leakage, the effect is the same. A NATO-sourced weapon system built within alliance-compatible standards was used in a strike that the alliance itself cannot easily categorize within its existing legal and institutional frameworks. This is not just a political problem. It is a structural one. because NATO was built on the assumption of shared threat perception, not identical interests, but compatible ones. That assumption allowed for flexibility. It allowed for internal disagreement. It allowed for political friction. What it did not anticipate was functional divergence at the level of weapon systems being used in ways that directly undermine the security of another member's strategic partner. There is no precedent for this. And where there is no precedent, institutions do not move quickly. They move cautiously, incrementally, and often behind the pace of events. The consequence is a growing mismatch between operational reality and institutional language. Statements of concern, calls for clarification, emergency consultations. These are diplomatic tools designed for escalation management. They are not designed for systemic contradiction. And yet, systemic contradiction is what now exists. Russia and China, observing from outside the immediate theater, are not interpreting Haifa as an isolated regional conflict. They are interpreting it as data. Data on alliance cohesion, data on escalation thresholds, data on the limits of American intervention under conditions of distributed responsibility. For Russia, the lesson is not simply about naval warfare. It is about NATO's internal elasticity. If alliance members can drift into actions that produce strategic outcomes contrary to alliance interests without triggering immediate structural consequences, then the alliance is not a fixed block. It is a network of conditional alignments. For China, the lesson is more operational. Saturation works, layered defenses have thresholds. And those thresholds can be reached not by technological superiority alone, but by volume, coordination, and timing. In any future maritime confrontation scenario, especially in the Indo-Pacific, that lesson is not theoretical, it is actionable. But perhaps the most significant transformation is not occurring in any single capital. It is occurring in the global understanding of predictability itself. For much of the post-Cold War era, the international system operated on the assumption that escalation pathways were relatively known, that if certain thresholds were crossed, responses would follow in broadly predictable ways. This predictability was the foundation of deterrence. It allowed states to calculate risk, to manage crises, to avoid miscalculation at scale. What Haifa demonstrates is not that those thresholds no longer exist, it is that they are no longer universally legible in the same way. Different actors now perceive different limits, different actors test different edges, and when perception diverges, deterrence becomes uneven. It still exists, but not uniformly. It becomes localized, conditional, situational, and systems built on deterrence do not collapse when they are broken. They fragment when they are interpreted differently by different participants. This fragmentation is what defines the current moment. The Mediterranean will remain a strategic theater. Naval power will continue to matter. Alliances will continue to function, but none of these will function exactly as they did before. Each will now operate with an additional layer of caution, not because capabilities have disappeared, but because certainty has eroded. And in international politics, the erosion of certainty is often more consequential than the loss of capability. The final question then is not what happened at Haifa. That part is already recorded, analyzed, and absorbed into countless intelligence assessments. The real question is what Haifa has made possible. Because every major strategic rupture does two things at once. It destroys an old equilibrium, and it creates space for new behavior that was previously too risky to consider. States will now adjust doctrines, revise assumptions, and recalibrate alliances, not in response to ideology, but in response to demonstrated reality. Some will interpret restraint as opportunity. Others will interpret it as warning. Some will move to harden their systems. Others will seek to exploit the gaps revealed. And all of them will be correct within their own logic. That is what makes this moment unstable. Not chaos, not collapse, but a transition period where the rules are no longer fully agreed upon, yet still partially in effect. The Mediterranean's still there, the fleets are still there, the alliances are still there, but the certainty that once held them together silently and invisibly has been disturbed. And the world that follows disturbances like this is never the same as the world that existed before them.